what I'm going to try to present today is a very easy step to make, but it's a kind of a dance step that requires a twirl. Though it's one step, the step involves a pivot. And so in your following of the education, in your keeping track of the movement of your development, the step today, though one step only, is a step with a twist. The pivot is traditionally called transformation. Transformation. And in using the term transformation, it essentially means that there is a formation, a formed, bounded arena or area, a locus of action, experience, and mental orientation, which is delimited by a boundary, and that the transformation goes beyond this form. Always, though, with the proviso that the form itself is still extant, it's still there, but has been carried to some new dimension. So that a transformation is the formation changed. And the change is of such a nature that it becomes infused with a kind of a spirit. The essential transformation is the transformation of grape juice into wine. The classic use of the term transformation means the outcome of the process of fermentation, literally grape juice into wine. So that wine was always the classic way in which transformation was indicated. And the transformative basis was always given the imagery of the grapevine, very often, with clusters of grapes, was the imagery which was the basis, the foundation, upon which the wine was made, and the wine itself was the symbol of the transformation. Grapes and vine became images of integration, whereas the wine became a symbol of the transformed quality. Now, it's difficult to go beyond this kind of simple identification, the simple presentation, because the identification, the whole process of identification, does not hold in transformation. Which is why our education on the ritual level now is so careful to not let us fall into the convenient comfort of identifications. Identities do not survive transformations. Identities do not survive transformations. And so very often, the symbol for an identification would be a mask, and the mask, in its proper ceremony, is in its place. Whereas a mask taken out of the ceremony becomes completely out of place. It becomes an object that no longer fits. And so the ego, no matter how refined the ego is, The ego always emerges out of a ritual comportment, always is fine-tuned by the mythology that is braided with that ritual comportment, and is always literally cemented into form by the symbol which synthesizes that form and holds the language and action and mental orientation into a whole, keeps the form what it is. The ego is always out of place in consciousness, for consciousness is a transformation. Consciousness is a wine. And the classic saying is, do not put new wine into old wineskins. Consciousness does not fit into the form of an ego, no matter how refined that ego is. And so one of the most perilous of all experiences is the death of the ego. And the death of the ego is it's a concomitant with transcendence. Transformation is always a transcendence of the ego. And if you are not prepared for this, the experience of transformation poignantly registers to the ego as its death, but a kind of a death that is oblivion. One of the most sophisticated presentations of this is in Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, the section called The Whole. And an identification that forms itself as an ego that undergoes a transformation without preparation experiences itself as a whole. A voracious whole that is so perilous that it must be covered up. And the ego reaches out to the world to try to find something, anything, all things, to cover up the whole which it now is. A more insightful examination of this existential crisis is in Sartre's little book called The Transcendence of the Ego. Now, there are many other ways to address this and write about this. I use Sartre because it is so fundamentally basic that from an initial standpoint, it's much easier initially to look at something like Sartre's presentation. But I don't use Sartre as a text here because Sartre himself has assumptions, has phenomenological assumptions that are very sophisticated. For instance, one cannot appreciate the strategy and structure of Sartre's language without having a background in phenomenology. Because the transcendence of Sartre's existentialism is founded on the eidetic reduction of Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. And without having a background in all of this, which requires many years of study, one can't really appreciate. So I go back to 2,500 years ago, and I present the Buddha and Euripides paired together because the Satipatthana Sutra of the Buddha and Euripides' Greek tragedy, the Bacchae, together present very accurately, even in more eidetic reduction than Husserl, even in more existential crisis than Sartre, exactly what happens, and our education is on level where we only have time to use cream of the cream. And though Husserl and Sartre are world-class philosophers, they are not on the cosmic level of the Buddha and Euripides. And we only have time for first string. Now the Buddha and Euripides both take a step which has a twist in it, a step which has a pivot, and that pivot is transformation. They take that step, and that step is after the cycle of nature has fulfilled itself, after nature has been selected by ritual, has been given language by myth, has been interiorized as mind by symbol, that is the completeness of that entire cycle. As a rule of thumb, you can say that a cycle is complete when all four parts are there. But the cycle does not include a fifth part in the Western psyche, because the fifth part in the Western psyche would be a fifth essence, a quintessence, and the quintessence in the Western psyche is always the center, but the center of the four-part cycle in the West is always a vanishing into another dimension. In the East Asian version of wisdom, there are always a five-part cycle. The quintessence, the fifth essence, the center, is worked into the cycle in such a way that the center is the third of the five parts. So that an East Asia integration cycle always runs 1, 2, 3 in the center, 4, 5. So that there is this kind of zigzag to an East Asia wisdom cycle. The East Asia presentation of integration does not allow for an invisible fifth point at the center, but makes it conspicuous as the fulcrum at the third part, whereas the Western tradition always is the 4 in a round, and the fifth, the quintessence, the center, is assumed to take place silently or completely within, so that the Western psyche has its completion in an inward, invisible, vanished point. This inward, hidden, vanished point surfaces as the unconscious in an analytical, therapeutic horizon which is meant to tease it out. If you go into an analytical situation, you can tease out of the 4-part completeness of the Western psyche something which is hidden, something which does not disclose itself immediately. And this was labeled, is labeled, appropriately labeled, the unconscious. Now, the person who developed this unconscious labeling to the greatest extent was Freud. And I suppose the most influential by the late 20th century development of that is Jung. But Jung and Freud used a concept of the unconscious developed by Eduard Hartmann. And so the idea of the unconscious in psychotherapy traces itself back to Eduard Hartmann, and Hartmann develops it largely through the insight of people like Goethe and Schiller. So if one seeks to find what is really the fertile ground of the Western idea of the unconscious as the quintessence, the fifth essence, one has to go back to Goethe and Schiller. A year from now, we will use one of Schiller's great books. When we come back a year from now to try to look at the conscious complement to ritual, the conscious complement to ritual is art. And at that time, we will use Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man. And Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man is one of the world's greatest books. It stands as a dagger of insight to an epic of maturation. The epic of maturation was written by Goethe, and it's called Faust, parts 1 and 2. It's just like the I Ching is an epic of maturation, and the little book which is the dagger of insight into the I Ching is the Tao Te Ching. Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man is like the Tao Te Ching. It's a dagger of insight into an epic of maturation. Whereas Lao Tzu was the dagger of insight into the I Ching, Schiller on the Aesthetic Education of Man as a dagger of insight into the maturation cycle of Faust. In Faust Part 1, one finds Goethe exploring integration. He explores the tremendous cycle which is there in nature. Nature, to its largest extent, includes what we do, what we say, and what we think. But what we are in what we do, what we experience in what we say, and what the truth is in what we think, is all of a piece of an integral cycle of four, joined forever with nature. But something else is there. Something else occurs. Something which is magical. Something which is conscious, which in the West is unconscious in terms of the integration cycle, and occurs as a fifth essence, a quintessence, as a step into consciousness. Whereas the East Asia tradition presents consciousness always as the third step, always Tao Te Jen, I Li. So that the development in the East Asia tradition of the third step, Jen, is not found in the epic of consciousness, the I Ching, nor is it found explicitly in the dagger of insight, the Tao Te Ching, but is found in the writings of Confucius. And all of the writings of Confucius are about the development of the implications of Jen being indispensably at the center. The Analects of Confucius, the Lun Yu, are all about the development of Jen. You find almost nowhere in the I Ching itself anything about Jen, either in the archaic I Ching of pre-dynastic China, nor in the Zhou dynasty revision of the I Ching, but in the commentaries written by Confucius on the I Ching, Jen is consistently distributed as the synthesizing symbol and the transformational implications. And so when you have the classic statement from the I Ching about what you should do is measured against the superior man. The superior man perseveres. The superior man does such and so, and therefore this will happen. That the predictive quality of the I Ching is exclusively dependent upon the factoring in and distribution of the quintessence of consciousness at the center of the cycle of maturation. And one reason why the East Asian psyche does not have a hidden quintessence, but has an explicated third phase that would have been unconscious, is that it's completely founded upon Confucian explication of what is happening. the development of the Confucian classics about 2,200 years ago obviated the development of an unconscious in China. And so if one takes a classic East Asian person into a psychoanalytic technique, one will not find an unconscious, but one would find a Confucian embellishment to their ritual, to their myth, to their symbols, which is evenly distributed throughout. Where does this appear? If one looks at ordinary, pre-industrial age, pre-20th century influenced Chinese, for the Chinese today have unconscious just like the West. In the last 50 or 60 years, the Japanese have developed unconscious, and they're very much like Westerners. But up until about the 1920s and the 30s, the Japanese were notorious for not having an unconscious, but the material that would have been unconscious was distributed so evenly through the ecology of ritual, myth, and symbol that it appeared in everyday life. For the Chinese, the quintessence appears in the whole process of eating. For the Chinese, the meal is the place where psychotherapy is distributed completely through the entire ecology of the family of everyday life. For the Chinese, the meal is the locus of the healing, of the balancing of ritual, myth, and symbol with the quintessence, which would be, in our education, it's called vision. Vision. In ancient times, it was called magic. The food of a Chinese meal is symbolic of the transformation of nature into the specialized conscious recipes that are served. The material from nature are transformed by the cooking and presented as an array, a boundless array, an infinite variability of Chinese recipes. And the Chinese are famous. Chinese cooking is famous for the infinite variety of recipes that they have. All of this surfaces in a very real way with the advent of mystery rituals. Mystery rituals indicate to us that there has been a transformation. It indicates in a recursive way, though not recognized as in the West, or though so recognized that it almost gets invisible as an everyday element in East Asia. In either way, it's very difficult to pick up on. The quintessence is so conspicuous in the East Asia psyche as to be almost invisible because it's everywhere. And in the Western psyche, it's so inconspicuous as to be hidden. So the problem in a critical recognition is the same level of difficulty East and West. The difficulty in the West is because it's hidden. And the difficulty in the East is that it's so out in the open, it's everywhere. Someone once commented that in India, it's very difficult to run across anything that doesn't have gods and goddesses in it. Everything in everyday life has it distributed everywhere, so it's everywhere. Whereas in the West, it's nowhere. So the problem is in a wisdom tradition, in the West to find what is hidden, and in the East to discover what is everywhere. And it's so ordinary because it's everywhere that you tend to discount it, to overlook it. in a way, an East Asia teacher reminds, whereas a Western teacher helps us to remember, to discover. The telltale sign always is that rituals cease to be in the integration mode and have a tincture of the differential mode. And thus, instead of just being rituals per se, they are now mystery rituals. The actions that take place have a covert meaning to them that is not discernible from nature, but is a tincture from consciousness. And the way to understand it simply is that the four-part cycle, with nature at the top, ritual at the side, myth on the bottom, and symbol on the other side, that this entire cycle has been rotated 90 degrees to the right. And instead of nature being the foundation for the cycle, ritual is now the foundation. But it's not ritual as it was, but it's transformed ritual or mystery ritual. So that mystery ritual now is the foundation. And where ritual was, one now finds myth. And where myth used to be, one now finds symbol. And where symbol used to be, one now finds vision. Or in the ancient way of speaking, magic. So that the new ecology, the new wholeness, the new cycle is mystery ritual, myth, symbol, magic. And this cycle is radically different from the cycle of nature. This mystery cycle is supernatural, above nature. Supernatural in that its whole basis is a transformed ritual, a ritual which no longer is a ritual comportment to nature, but is secretly a ritual comportment to consciousness. And myth is no longer a language of nature, but is secretly a language of transformative magic. And symbols, instead of being symbols of integration, are symbols of integration and also of differentiation at the same time. And the mind, instead of being structured by symbols, is now structured by the transformed, the transformed. Whatever is transformed now is the mind, and that mind is radically different from an integral mind. It's a mind that is ambidextrous. It can be integrative or differential at the same time, interchangeably at any time. And so the transformed mind was always characterized by an element, mercury, quicksilver. The first step in understanding a transformation is that one does not change lead into gold, but one changes lead into quicksilver. And it's the quicksilver mind, which is supernatural, is capable now of making the gold. This is, of course, not very well understood. Why? Because it was never well expressed. Why? Not because men and women were stupid, but because they were wise and they knew not to express it in terms that would be mistaken reductively for something in the natural process. Now, the ego, by its structure, by its design, by its purpose, by its nature, the ego is an integration form. its whole basis of being made, the whole method by which it is made, the whole purposes for which it is made, the whole stuff out of which it is completely bounded in the integration cycle. So that transformation is a poison to the ego. It cannot use it. Now, the whole point about Greek tragedy is that Greek tragedy is a transformation of a form that once was in the natural cycle. That form in the natural cycle was a fundamental, basic, human quality, completely natural, that had to do with fertility. And the object, the ritual, included an object that was elevated to a symbol, and that object elevated to a symbol was the phallus. And in ancient rural Greece, every spring, there were fertility festivals. And not having gone through the sieves of various Edwardian or Victorian reticence about such things, because peasants around the world are very much earthy. That's how they are. They used to have a procession where they would have this mock-up, this mask of a phallus that would be carried on poles joyfully into the center of the village amid song and dance and celebration. And the Greek word for this entire entourage was pompe. Pomp. And the pompe was the arrival of fertility in the ritual year of spring, and the way in which human life fitted in with the ritual year, and that we are also fertile, and here's a celebration of it. And the basic songs that were there were songs about the fertility of animals like goats. And so they were called literally goat songs. And out of these goat songs came a Greek poetic form called the dithyramb, and the dithyramb was the language vehicle that was transformed by Greek tragedy into one of the highest language forms ever made on the planet. And out of the goat songs came Greek tragedy. And also, because it's ambidextrous, Greek comedy. And in the very finest, highest level of consciousness, in Greek comedy, for instance, in Aristophanes, in the Old Comedy, where he is writing about the most incredible development of consciousness of his day, the development of philosophy as a teachable, transformative method pioneered by Socrates and honed by Plato. One of Aristophanes' greatest comedies is called The Clouds, Nubis. And The Clouds is all about Socrates. And in the comedy, Socrates makes a stage appearance. He's lowered from the ceiling in a basket. A basket case comes from this. If you think too much along Socrates' line, you're going to end up as a basket case. In Old Comedy, all of the actors wore strapped onto them huge phalluses. Because all of this action, even though it concerns high conscious transformation, was in the setting of a ritual that went back to this fertility goat dance. And what was important for the Greeks of Aristophanes' time was not to lose track of the fact that here are two indispensable, completely, radically different things that are related. One has to keep the earthy ritual comportment of integration, and yet one is constrained equally to have the ritual mysteries of transformation exactly at the same place at the same time. So that every action now has a double quality. It is an earthy, integral action, but it also is at one and the same time a transformational mystery action. The new Greek mythological divine figure who embodied mystery ritual was Dionysus. Dionysus was the new god on the block. He was the new addition to the pantheon. The old Olympic pantheon of the integration cycle did not include him. He was not there. In fact, if one looks at the classic Olympian pantheon, the Homeric presentation of the Greek gods, the major gods, there are 6 women and 6 men. But before this court of balanced justice of nature comes some new figure who does not figure in, Dionysus, who is a male god but always entails eliciting female energy. So Dionysus in and of himself is both male and female. And the Greek pantheon, the Olympian structure of balance, is completely upset by Dionysus. Because ostensibly, though he is a male, he is also always concerned with female energy, with fertility, with procreation, with the mystery that transformation happens within nature. That a birth comes magically from someone who already is accounted for completely by the natural cycle, and yet something else happens. Now, this complete radicalization of the integration process means that instead of fertility happening in the spring, that fertility is recursively moved back to midwinter. Instead of having a fertility cycle in the spring, one has a hidden beginning of the fertility cycle in midwinter. That the ritual spring is now moved back seemingly to where nature was, and one starts with mystery ritual in midwinter, so that the winter solstice became the locus, the grand locus for mystery rituals to begin. And in the spring, instead of ritual, that's where the new myth comes into play. The new language forms unveil themselves in the spring, not as in the old integration natural cycle in the summer solstice. Instead of celebrating songs of the sun in midsummer, one now celebrates the mystery, the hidden mystery of life in the spring with magical, mythical language. And instead of symbols coming into the harvest in the autumn, symbols now, or symbols used to be the culmination of that whole cycle from autumn to midwinter. Used to be the last fourth of the year. Used to be the time of harvesting the symbols. Now the symbols are moved up so that they take place in between the summer solstice and the autumnal equinox. And something new is there in the winter of the season. Something new is there in the culmination. The new quarter that's there is magical consciousness. So that we have to take now a revision, but the revision has to be held very lightly because it's difficult to bring this into play. Notice that the central word here will be mystery. We said that nature is in no way ever static. Nature is a matrix of change, and what could be said that characterizes nature is mystery. Nature itself, qua nature, is neither tragic nor comic, but is mysterious. So mystery characterizes nature in integration, and integral rituals are always realistic because they must found existence. Life has to count on them being natural. But mystery rituals that now displace nature are the basis for magic being activated and for transformation now being counted into what happens. When this occurs, the rule of thumb for the Western psyche is that there can be only 4 parts to any cycle. The 5th part is always hidden. In the natural cycle, consciousness is hidden. But in the radical transformed cycle, nature is now hidden. The first stage, the first phase becomes hidden. Ritual, myth, symbol, and vision now constitute the cycle, and the 5th essence, nature, becomes hidden. And so the alchemical term for nature is not just simply nature, but is something like mysterium magnum, the great allness of the mystery. Nature becomes the unconscious. So to the differential consciousness, to the magical psyche, nature is hidden, is there, but is hidden and must be brought out. Whereas to the tribal psyche, consciousness is hidden, and they hardly know it's there. A pair of problems comes out of this. There are many problems that come out, but this pair is like the devil's own pitchfork. You know, I see the devil with mini-prong pitchfork. One of the best devil cartoons I ever saw was in a early 50s Punch magazine from Britain. And it showed a lifeguard. And it was the devil as a lifeguard, and he had his big pitchfork. And there's this pool, boiling, nauseous pool, and people are trying to crawl out, and he keeps coming down off the lifeguard thing, pitching them back in. Instead of saving them from the pool, he throws them back in with his pitchfork. Well, this is a devil's pitchfork that has only 2 prongs. The prongs are this. To the ego, consciousness is a surreality. It's a dangerous, perilous, magical supernaturalness. We don't want to mess with it. But to the radical consciousness that has included magic and now has nature hidden, the natural ego seems to them naive. And so there's a double peril. The tribe thinks you as a conscious person, a conscious being, are surreal, and you as a conscious being think the tribe is naive. And the surreal and the naive mutually exclude each other not simply by a natural distribution of being different types, but on being whole different orders. And so this lightning jagged edge is like tearing humanity in two, but modifying one of the edges, smoothing it out by consciousness so that its geometricness is beautiful to consciousness, but no longer fits very easily with its natural half. And so you have a problem with a society that has two disparate populations. A population of a powerful few who have made the jump to consciousness and now have gone into a supernatural mode, who have a taste for mystery rituals, and a basic peasant population who consider these people absolutely irreligious because they destroy the natural ritual qualities with all this mumbo jumbo. And so you have a population of people that characterize Buddha's India and Euripides' Greece. Both places at the very same time had the same problem of incommensurates. Yet both the Buddha and Euripides came to the same, or one should say similar, conclusion. That the two halves were complements to a more comprehensive whole, and that there was evidently more to the story of man than had yet been told. That therefore we needed to explore the new world at the same time as remembering the old world. We had to go into finding out what is this new quality that we now, some of us, inhabit. We have to explore this. Yet we have to remember that the old is not naive, but is important and valuable to save. This kind of balance was always jeopardized by the fact that it was not able to be handled as long as polarities were the key to structure. It could only be happen when there was reconciliation of opposites. Let's take a break and we'll come back. We're talking about how in primordial Greek ritual in the villages, the carrying aloft on poles, the phallus, and the entourage coming behind with the goat songs, leading the procession was always figures that held food, so that nutrition always is woven into sexuality in primordial societies. Jung once commented, someone knew was at Ascana, where the Uranus conferences were being held, and some of the world's greatest thinkers were collected there, 20 or 30 of them, and several hundred very sophisticated people. And the person asked Jung, well, what do you people talk about in the evenings after the programs? And Jung said, it's mostly food talk. Nutrition is more fundamental than sexuality, but always has sexuality woven into it in peasant societies, in primordial human societies. Food and fertility always brought together. So that in the Greek procession, one always has the food, the fertility, and the songs. And so one has this kind of quality, like the Chinese, of distributing the consciousness equally among all the facets exemplified by the common meal together, exemplified by their food. So that there is a quality to ritual when it becomes mysterious, that there are, for the first time, hidden meanings that are brought out for so-called common, so-called ordinary, so-called worldly elements, so that you have then a sense of this peculiar quality, the first movement in the recognition of peculiarity is the sense of irony. One begins to have an ironical tone that, isn't this unusual? Isn't this strange? Isn't that remarkable? How ironical. And so, in 5th century Greece, the initial movement into consciousness was always characterized by the development of a sense of irony. In fact, it's called, in the history of world civilization, it's called Socratic irony, because Socrates is the first to exemplify, the first to use language that was very conscious of the ironical tone. But Socratic irony deepens. It's like some swimmer who, used to swimming in a river or in a small body of water, swims for the first time in the ocean and finds, notice the dramatic concomitants, finds, with all the fire sirens that consciousness is able to have, that when you swim in the ocean, if you go out far enough, the water deepens radically. That you cannot swim too far out into the Aegean off Point Sunion before the depth of the water greatly exceeds that of any pool you ever saw. And what seemed like a simple exercise of almost bathing now becomes exposed to the jeopardy of the deep. This quality of the deepening of irony quickly into paradox. And paradox, unlike irony, paradox deepens into oceanic depths. The paradoxical can become perilous very quickly. And so irony deepens into paradox. And at the interchange, at the membrane, at the transition between irony and paradox, that interface characterizes, on one hand, tragedy, and on the other hand, comedy. Greek comedy is that you can just simply turn around and swim back to shore. Greek tragedy is that you turn the wrong way and you swim out to sea and it gets deeper. It's this kind of reflexive quality here that one finds epitomized in Euripides' Bacchae. The Bacchae is the last great Greek tragedy. The first Greek tragedy is The Persians by Aeschylus, written by Aeschylus. Aeschylus, who was one of the most dramatic voices of world literature. Aeschylus, who, as a young man, fought in the Persian Wars. He fought at the very first Persian War that the Greeks won at the Battle of Marathon. I'm uncertain as to the extent of your background, and let me just paint for you the picture so that you understand the illusion that I'm going to talk to you about Aeschylus. The Persian Empire extended everywhere from India to northern Greece, to Thrace, and the only piece missing for them was the inclusion of Greece proper into the Persian Empire. And the Persian forces were about 10 times the size of the Greek forces. But they brought them over by ships, and they were landing the ships at the beach in the Bay of Marathon in order to have a broad plain so as to assemble their enormous army, and then they were going to scour the mainland of Greece, north, south, and west from the landing site, so that Marathon was the Normandy beach of the Persians. The Greeks got wind of this plan, and a small contingent of only several hundred Greeks rushed from the city of Athens, accompanied by contingents from just several little villages. They ran all night with full armor. They ran over the mountain passes, down onto the plain of Marathon, ran across the plain of Marathon, and fought the Persians before they could disembark their enormous army. They were partially disembarked, and they had cases of crates of logistic supplies on the beach, and the Greeks caught the Persians so unaware, so unprepared in such a ferocious preemptive strike that the Persians were unable to effect their landing, and not being really seafaring people, were thrown into confusion, and the entire invasion of Greece was put off for 10 years. When Aeschylus died, he was the most famous playwright in the world. He wrote his own epitaph, and it didn't mention a single fact about his being a tragedian. He was buried in Gela in Sicily, and his epitaph read, "Here lies Aeschylus, whom the long-haired Persian descendants can still tell of his valor." To us, it seems impossible that someone who was the greatest playwright, the Shakespeare of his day, could not even have mentioned the fact that he was a writer on his epitaph. What to Aeschylus was deep water was the recognition that the Greeks at Marathon had inescapably entered a world of war that could not be stopped until they had established the empire which the Persians were trying to establish. That the course of military engagement with an empire requires of you tragically that if you beat them, you must now become them. And the Persians, as a Greek tragedy, the first Greek tragedy, is the first beginning, deepening of the irony into the paradox of empire. So that Greek tragedy itself as a conscious form, as a magical form, as a conscious form, as a visionary transformation of nature, shows that when you take a pivot into transformation, the new world of consciousness now must be explored. You must now include that in your life. And by and large, Greek tragedy was an urban development of rural peoples who could never go back to the farms. They must stay in the city, and the city must grow ever larger. So the Athens of the days of Greek tragedy is an Athens of an urban civilization vis-a-vis a tribal background. The people still were, in their feeling tones, tribally oriented. The great families were still the social structure of the city of Athens. They were emotionally family, traditional people, tribally oriented, and they could never go back to that because their minds had transcended those feeling-toned comfort zones. And so Greek tragedy as a form was developed as a curing bridge, as a relationality between the rural naturalness which could never be recovered in its original purity, a yearning for a lost Eden, and the necessity of exploring the new heavenly expanses of consciousness, which somehow had to be reconciled with the old. So that the problems of a future paradise, a city which would be matured to the point of a utopia, which would then reestablish the security of the old paradise of nature fulfilled. And this became a crutch at the time. One of Aristophanes' greatest comedies is called Birds, Aves. And the birds establish a city in the clouds called Cloud Cuckoo Land. And this bird city refuses to let the smoke of sacrifice from men go to the gods. And so the gods are starving because they get no rewards from sacrifice, and men are starving because they get no help from the gods, and the birds decide to exact their tariff share of everything from both gods and men. We want our percentages, or you get nothing. And so it's a comedy about the birds interfering with heaven and earth, and they're coming together. It's the perfect comedy of the tragic situation that is shown by a play which would have been contemporaneous with Birds of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. And Oedipus Rex shows the tragic situation where man is so divorced from the gods as to no longer believe that they compel him. Oedipus tries everything to not fall into the trap which divinity has laid by structuring out punishment for infraction of natural rules. And yet, try as he will, conscious as he thinks that he is, he still fails exactly on the point as predicted. It's not that one doesn't know, and therefore the tragic flaw occurs and the fall happens. It's that one does know, and despite whatever you can do, it still happens. You still fall into the flaw. You still fail. This is the tragedy. And so the Oedipus Rex of Sophocles and the Birds of Aristophanes come close together. Tragedy and comedy over the same thing. In Euripides, in his Bacchae, the great tragedy that's there in the Bacchae is held in balance by a development not of comedy, but a development that takes the sense of irony deeper than where comedy had left it off, takes it into philosophy. And the early Platonic dialogues balance the Bacchae. The Platonic dialogue of Phaedo, especially, is a balance to Euripides' Bacchae. The death of Socrates, where Socrates shows that he is not fearing his death, but that he's welcoming a transformation into an unexplored terrain. He says, I will not repent of inquiring of others as to the development of their ideas of belief. In fact, I have heard that everyone who has ever lived is there in Hades, so I will in Hades interview everyone with the same method. And so Plato's deepening, especially in the Phaedo, deepening of irony into paradox into a philosophic transcendence, makes a mystery ritual where there would have just been the ritual. For the powerful group of authoritarian clique rulers in Athens, forcing Socrates to drink poison, to drink the hemlock, to them is a ritual which ends in his death. To Socrates' transformed vision, the poison is an invitation to an afterlife of indefinite variability and expanse. Now, I have not paired Plato's Phaedo with Euripides' Bacchae because our education is not simply the education of 5th century Greeks or of even of Westerners. We have to prepare ourselves for a whole world, for an entire planetary culture. But the planetary culture itself is but a prelude. It's just for openers, because the true, larger form is that of a civilization that covers the entire star system. Everything from Earth throughout all the planets and all the moons and the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud, so that the civilization of man within the next 200 years will spread out to be about a light year across the entire star system. And one would call this, and I call this, a stellar civilization. That the civilization inhabits an entire star system because the basic atomic structure for universal life is that of a star system. Not even of a planet. A single planet is hardly a civilization in terms of the universe. A star system. As Robert Heinlein wrote in his Future History Chronology about 3 generations ago, he predicted that the first mature human civilization would take place in the middle of the 22nd century. That everything up till then was like kindergarten and was just for openers and hadn't really reached full maturity. In a very peculiar way, Heinlein was, as usual, almost frighteningly right. Heinlein predicted before it happened by a whole generation that there would be a hiatus in space travel of about 30 to 40 years. And the hiatus in space travel of 30 to 40 years, nobody's been to the moon now for 24 years. And there's going to be nobody on the moon for another 12 to 15, 20 years. So there'll be that kind of hiatus. Heinlein was the only person in the world who predicted it, because he understood human nature. There were no Miami beaches immediately after Columbus. It took a long time for people to get wise that there was money to be made in real estate there. And after they get wise, then they do it. And you can see that Miami Beach is flourishing, as is the Americas. Well, so too, the star system will flourish, but not right now. Right now, it's still hidden because the nature of the Western psyche is that its conscious vision is hidden as long as we remain in the integration mode. As long as we are obsessed with integrating, differentiation remains hidden. And as soon as we begin to get the vision, what becomes hidden in its place is nature. And so on one hand, you have a few people who understand the vision, not just of the future, but the vision of consciousness. But to them, the natural is so naive that they discount it. They don't pay any attention to it. And so nature languishes. Well, the bulk of the population find it surrealistic and anathema that anybody would want to go out there for any reasons whatsoever, and their completely unnatural look at them. And so they should be squelched and squashed and discounted generally. as being surrealistic monsters. And so between the accusations of you're naive and you're surreal, nothing gets done in terms of wholeness, in terms of fullness, in terms of the development of maturity. This education is meant to address this in a massive, comprehensive way. Because there's not just a problem, or even a whole field of problems, but there are many orders of fields of problems, and all of them have to be dealt with together at the same time. Yet, the dealing with them cannot be so multivalent and multidimensional as to happen all at once initially. One has to educate oneself in discrete phases first, otherwise the disorientation becomes too much. It's like California trying to teach youngsters whole language systems and forgetting about teaching phonics and basic steps like that. And California now, as of just this week, ranks lowest in all of the 50 states for education. Whereas 25 years ago, California was first. It's now last. And this is not a sign of humility that the last shall be first. It's a sign of massive misunderstanding about the way in which education happens. But not only that, the tragedy of grade school children is paltry compared to the tragedy of universities. I won't go into it, but it's a house of cards, to say the least. We need to pay attention for our livelihood and our life to the way in which the phases of actuality occur. And even though they occur aligned and together, in order to investigate them in an educational way, they must be discreetly presented, syllable by syllable, until we learn to pronounce the word, and then we can use the word in James Joycean proliferation and have fun. But first we have to learn to pronounce the word right. Without being able to pronounce the magical phrase right, no transformation can happen, and transformation is evoked by the fullness of the integral cycle. As soon as one completes integration, it is an open invitation for differentiation to come into play. Now, this particular step, this stage, has happened again and again in the history of men and women on this planet. Indeed, happened in the history of many planets and many star systems from many kinds of beings, because it is a basic structure of the real. It always happens this way. One could read Isaac Asimov's great Foundation series and find that, yes, this kind of fundamental little empire building clique type stuff happens even on scale of galactic civilization. That there's no amount of sophistication or alienness inculcated that will obviate some of the basic structures of the way in which the real discloses itself. We're talking about mystery rituals being the first indication that consciousness has been included into the cycle and that nature is now hidden, so that whereas in an integration mode, consciousness is hidden, in a differential tinged mode, nature is hidden. Which means that consciousness is conscious largely by virtue of trying to find out what is real about nature. That the mystery of nature, the hidden mystery of nature now is an object of inquiry. And that is part and parcel of being conscious. That magic is all about finding the structure by which nature works, by which it is what it is. And what is it? It is a process that works. How does it work? So that the advent of mystery rituals indicates the recursive influence of consciousness. Ritual, then, as mystery ritual, displaces nature. Everything moves 90 degrees. Everything moves so that if you are looking at the geometry of the structure, the key to understanding the structure is characterized by a right angle, a 90-degree triangle. That navigation now in consciousness, the initial navigation in initial consciousness, is by the Pythagorean right angle triangle. You need a triangle to do navigation. And the right angle triangle is exactly the locus, the key, the focus, the synthesizing symbol for navigating in a ritual myth-based ecology. So that the very first conscious pilot of the Greek civilization was Pythagoras. Not Socrates, but Pythagoras. So that when you scratch the Platonic dialogues, whose central synthesizing protagonist is Socrates, when you scratch the Platonic dialogues to look into the conscious structure, the hidden nature of the Platonic dialogues, one finds that behind the figure of Socrates is the spirit of Pythagoras. And the deeper one goes into Plato, the more it occurs to you that the really moving symbol here is controlled by Pythagorean understanding and not by Socratic presentation. And that in antiquity, in the classical learned Hellenistic period of Alexandria, in the age when Rome was coming into power, the deepest teaching of Plato was always by tetralogies, of grouping the dialogues together into fours. Because when you group the Platonic dialogues into fours, into stages of fours, one then finds the cycles of wholeness in how the transformation works. Because the Platonic dialogues allow themselves to be grouped into tetralogies, because the original pioneering of that kind of conscious language was done by the Greek tragedians, and Greek tragedies were never presented one at a time, but always in tetralogies. Always. There never was a tragedy. There was always a cycle of four, three of which were tragedies, and one of which was a satyr play. Because if you're going to navigate in consciousness, you need triangulation, you need a trilogy of tragedies, but for wholeness, you have to keep the four-part structure, and the fourth part was a satyr play, because that was the taproot down into when ritual was integrative, when nature was still visible. And so the satyr plays that accompanied the trilogy of tragedies together is that four-part cycle of wholeness in search of the quintessence. There are no satyr plays in Chinese literature at all. There are no tragedies in Chinese literature at all. There are no comedies in Chinese literature. But there was no hidden fifth essence in Chinese civilization either. It was always a different presentation of it. And yet there are analogies. There are parallels, but the parallels are such that one has to be educated on planetary, if not on a stellar civilization scale, to be able to understand it. The transformation that happens in East Asia is characterized by the Buddha. The historical Buddha comes at that interface, at that peculiar time. It's a contemporary, very largely, of Pythagoras. The historical Buddha was born about 560 BC, and Pythagoras was born about 530 BC. The historical Buddha had his parinirvana about 480 BC, the same year that Socrates was born. And Pythagoras lives into Socrates' life long enough so that Socrates' teacher Diotima, who was a Pythagorean, had time to introduce Socrates as a young man personally to the Pythagorean mode of life, still held by the old master. For educational purposes, the Pythagorean mode of life is that once you radically introduce consciousness, you have to hold language in abeyance, in suspension, for a ritual period of time to allow the mysteriousness of the depths of language to fill in and color and rise to the surface so that your language is no longer naive. So Pythagorean silence was an incubation period where your linguistic capacity, the mind that could use words, didn't use them so that it lay fallow, so that the nutrition of the silence would filter in and distribute the unspoken wisdom, so that the next time that you spoke with wise words, with what the Greeks called winged words. So one could always tell a Pythagorean, and that we would call them today, the word that we use is mystics. That they spoke a mystical language, but they spoke it as if it were natural to them. And the mystical language is never understandable by tribal people. They never are able to hear it. Because a mystical language always has a transformed grammar. It always has a transformed syntax. Its vocabulary is always scintillating with multiple meanings. And you can test this out for yourself. Take any cassette of any lecture of mine and play it for your friends. What will they hear? Very little. Very little. If you will play that same cassette over and over again, they will build up a tolerance of being able to hear. And after about the 20th time, they'll say, wow, because it's there, but it's there in a form which is supernatural to them, which is surreal to them. Not from wanting to be esoteric, but from the necessity of being honest and realistic about what is being presented and keeping the language in keeping with what is being presented. In the 5th century BC, Athens, very few people could hear Greek tragedy, and that's why every single free man was compelled to go. You were fined if you did not go. They had special proctors at the time of the presentation of the tragedies who had this rope that they stretched across the streets of Athens, and they literally combed the city, marched into your houses and dragged the men out and shepherded them, herded them into the theater of Dionysius. Take your seat, you're going to hear this. Because it was absolutely essential to a conscious urban civilization for its survival that there be a population, especially of the men who held property, who were at least nominally participating in this, even under point of coercing them to participate. because it is a precarious flaw. It is a sign of certain failure if there's not a sufficient population of people to float consciousness. Because consciousness, vis-a-vis those tribal natural people, is a dangerous, perilous beast. It is a Frankenstein, and it should be killed. Ladies and gentlemen, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein about the time that her genius husband, Percy Shelley, was translating Aeschylus. Shelley, who saw that one of the great meta-tragedies of Western civilization was that Aeschylus's Prometheus, bound, was preserved without the following two tragedies. And so he wrote Prometheus Unbound as a revolutionary act of world civilization to fill in something that had been missing for over 2,400 years. And while he was writing his Prometheus Unbound, his wife, Mary Shelley, was writing the new Prometheus, which was retitled Frankenstein. You want to talk about getting real? This is what has been happening for the last 200 years. These are the headlines in the paper called History on This Planet. This is what's really happening. This is what is practical. When Thoreau was discovered by himself to be titanic genius at age 17, 18, he recognized it because he was making his own translations of Aeschylus from the Greek and suddenly woke up to what Aeschylus was saying. And those of us here in Los Angeles are rather fortunate because Thoreau's handwritten translations of Aeschylus are in the Huntington Library over here in San Marino. And when you look at Thoreau's work, you can see in the very autograph the tremendous energy and excitement that the young Thoreau, the teenage Thoreau, who suddenly is no longer just a citizen of Concord, but becomes a citizen of the universe almost overnight, because he woke up to the fact that there's a huge drama going on called civilization, and that it's at a transcendent membrane of great advancement right next door in Thoreau's friend's living room, Emerson. And Emerson, who positioned himself, Emerson's house stands right next to the bridge in Concord where the first shot in the Revolutionary War was fired. The first shot in the beginnings of what became the United States was right there at the front gate of Emerson, and he was having the first shot in the transcendent revolution that was changing the revolution. So there's a whole structure of context that once you begin to get it, all the shards fit together and become something else. What do they become? To the ordinary mind, it becomes a mirror, but to the transformed mind, it becomes a window. And this happens east and west. In East Asian civilization, the development of the original Buddhism in India reached a saturation point, which commanded that there be, according to universal rules of transformation, a massive development. The development in India was crimped so that Buddhism in India suffered a maiming. It's called the Gupta Age in India civilization. If one looks at Gupta sculpture, one finds all kinds of bare bosom voluptuous women. One does not find men in monks' habits. Because the transformational interface was that between men and women. And the old monkish Buddhism had no cognizance whatever of the new Tantra. They didn't get it at all. It was anathema to them. Whereas in the development of Tibet, in the development of China, this quality of interchange became of paramount interest and importance. And the trigger in the whole development was the vanishing of the simile of the mind as a mirror. And the figure historically who presents that was Hui Ning. Hui Ning is the Chinese Buddha. Hui Ning, who was born about 635 AD, becomes a Taoist Buddha who carries Buddhism out of India. Instead of it having Hindu roots, he transplants Buddhism into China where it has Taoist roots. And Taoist Buddhism becomes Chan, which became Zen. Zen has very little to do with Hindu gods. It has everything to do with the radical consciousness, where mysteriorized ritual displaces the old tribal ritual. Hui Ning had competition. The most famous teacher of the day was a monk named Shen Shui. Shen Shui wrote a verse which is the perfection of the integration cycle. His verse is, "The body is the Bodhi tree, the mind is like a clear mirror. At all times we must strive to polish it and must not let the dust collect." The first line is pure ritual. The body is the Bodhi tree. The second line is pure symbol. The mind is like a clear mirror. The third line is pure myth. Myth purified integrally. At all times we must strive to polish it. And the fourth line is pure nature in an integration mode, and must not let the dust collect. Hui Ning tore that verse completely diagonally. His verse was, notice the first line will be radical ritual. Bodhi originally has no tree. The second line is radical symbol. The mirror also has no stand. The third line is radical myth. Buddha nature is always clear and pure. And the fourth is radicalized nature as magical vision. Where is there now room for dust? More next week.